Hey, welcome back to Revenue Optimization Radio. It's the one show that takes a look at, well, how to optimize your revenue. Hosted by Patrick Morrissey, CMO of Altify. Revenue Optimization Radio is brought to you by those good folks. So why hold back? Let's have them tell you more right now.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Revenue Optimization Radio. Thanks to all of you who subscribe via iTunes, or if you get it on Apple Music, Spotify, wherever you find Revenue Optimization Radio, including revenueoptimizationradio.com. We greatly appreciate your support and your feedback around here. And I wanted to check in with everybody on something that is, I think, top of mind for most organizations, which is a strategy around content and content marketing. Part of the reason this is top of mind for me is I'm down in San Diego this week at the Seismic user conference, Seismic Shift. So I had the pleasure today to actually have a conversation and moderate a fireside chat with a couple senior executives, Susan O'Driscoll, who's the Senior Vice President of Marketing for Bank of America Merchant Services, and her counterpart, Natasha Collins, who runs planning and is the SVP of Sales Operations for B of A Merchant Services. So that was a really interesting conversation, and I'm going to actually work to have those women on this program and get into the details about what we covered. So we'll save that for a different time. I wanted to give everybody a couple observations from the world of content and operations and strategy, because Seismic put on a great event, but what it keyed into was several different observations that I've seen both in my professional life, as well as we've had a number of guests on the show talking about the intersection between sales and marketing and content, and how do you really activate the revenue team with the right kind of information that's going to help them tell a compelling story, frankly, in a way that's really going to drive revenue and it's going to drive customer outcomes. The Seismic conference, and soon I'm going to be going to the Dreamforce conference, and I'm going to be part of the Upland Altify CRO Summit at Dreamforce with some great speakers and some great executives talking about the future of sales, the future of revenue optimization, where the market's going. But oftentimes, strategy very quickly devolves into what am I trying to get done today, and what are we doing to help the revenue team produce this week, this month, this quarter? And I think that's something where the whole dialogue around content and a content strategy and some of the themes that I saw at the Seismic Shift conference this week, I think are really top of mind for a lot of people broadly across revenue and operations. A few key insights here from the Seismic conference itself. The first thing is, you're always wondering when you come into a conference, particularly one you haven't been to before, like who else is going to be there? Who is really the target audience maybe, but maybe who, in this case, who cares about content? And so the first observation that I found really interesting is I think many people think about content as either the realm of sales enablement or marketing. And one of the things I was surprised to find in speaking to conference attendees, listening to some of the speakers, is that there were a lot of people in the audience, both at a senior executive level and then in mid-level leadership and managers as well, really focused on sales enablement, sometimes called sales enablement, sometimes called sales excellence, sales support. There's a variety of titles that largely go into sales enablement. No surprise, they're really focused on how do we develop content and assets, and how do we actually manage those assets in a way that's going to feed our sales team. That's audience number one. The second audience, as you might suspect, is our friends in marketing, from CEOs and senior marketing leaders to really a lot of people on the front lines of demand generation, of managing content, managing programs, and really trying to figure out how to scale the machine across a variety of industries. And again, I think that would be very consistent with what you might expect from a conference like this. Is you've got senior level marketers, oftentimes marketing and product marketing specifically are on the hook to help feed the demand generation machine, to build campaigns and programs, as well as to scale the content assets and the message out. But surprisingly, the third audience that was at Shift this week that I was very surprised by just the number and the seniority of them were actually sales leaders. Interestingly, as I step back and I look at the market and some of the conversations I had, there were a lot of sales leaders at mid-size and even large organizations who were really coming to the dialogue with a focus on we need to understand content and content operations more deeply. We really need to understand the mechanics of how do we tell the story and how do we bring it to life? How do we get it not just to our customers, but also how do we better understand and how do we connect the dots with what do senior salespeople need to be successful? It was an interesting and a little bit of an eye-opener for me because I think a lot of times content is relegated to, in a lot of people's minds, yeah, that's some junior marketing person. Or when the marketing people get their act together, then they're going to send it to the sales enablement people. We'll get it to the field at some point. The first interesting observation from Shift for me was that there is an increasing awareness in sales ops and sales leaders about the importance of content, and maybe as importantly, the importance of telling the message or qualifying the category, and what are the mechanics behind bringing a content strategy to life in a way that's going to help us sell. That's the first big observation that I had really as I think about the week, and I'm hearing from a number of different speakers and a number of different perspectives. The second big observation I had from the Seismic Shift conference is really the importance of and the discipline around both process and regulation. We touched on it in my session today, but I was surprised by the number of speakers and the ecosystem that Seismic's developed around financial services. And I think that's an interesting use case just because not only is there a lot of big companies represented and a lot of component parts of the ecosystem around financial services, but also that's a highly regulated industry. The idea that the old school version of marketing is going to develop the presentation or some content assets and white papers and research reports and just kick it out to the salespeople, then they're just going to make it happen and they're going to distribute it and we're going to do campaigns and so on around it. That it's not nearly that simple in financial services. So there were a lot of organizations and a lot of domain expertise from partners that were at Seismic Shift really talking about what are the workflows, what are the regulations, what are the validation rules you have to have, what is the reporting and what's the audit trail look like. And oh, by the way, not all content is really relevant, frankly, for a lot of different segments. So when you start to think of regulated industries like financial services, healthcare, life sciences, pharma being top of the list there too, there is a growing ecosystem and a growing level of sophistication around and regulation around what does content look like. And frankly, for a lot of us who've grown up in marketing or have been on both sides of this equation like I have for marketing and sales, trying to figure out what content resonates and are we really delivering compelling messages, the idea of the extra layers of regulation and the specificity around targeting markets and making sure that you're doing it inside the guardrails of regulation is critically important. And again, that's something where sales has a lot to say about that because they're on the front lines of making sure that they are compliant with the processes and with the regulations and that they're doing the right thing for their customers and they're doing it in a way that doesn't subject their organization to any kind of regulatory potential issues or exposure. The third big observation I have around the Seismic conference, and I expect to see this in a few weeks when I go to the Compose conference. We had Toby Murdoch on the show a couple weeks ago from Uplink Compose, and he was talking about the explosion of content and how we got here. One of the things he keyed on, if you go back to that episode, which I'd recommend to you from a couple weeks ago, what he talked about was the rise of content marketing as a function. And he kind of keyed on the issue that a lot of us in marketing have, which is you need to have content and you need to develop content to actually feed the demand generation machine. And the trap that a lot of organizations fall into is that if some content is good, more content is better. And Toby was pretty adamant when he was on the show. The reality of content today is that it needs to be strategic, it needs to be operationalized, and it really needs to be baked in a strategy. One of the things that I heard in big and small ways across the conference this week is there's what I would consider a little bit of content fatigue. Everybody understands that whether it's the needs for the sales team, for the marketing team, oftentimes there are technical or specialist content involved. If you think about financial services and all the different discrete segments and how diverse that industry is and how large it is and how many different subsegments are being served, the content needs are absolutely enormous for many marketing organizations. And I know there's a lot of us who have been, particularly on the marketing side of the fence, in our QBR or a business review or an ops review, where the lament from the sales leaders is some version of, you know what, we would have sold a lot better, a lot more effectively if we just had another white paper, or we had another data sheet, or we had another case study, name the content piece. But there's always a reason that sales leaders can point back to in terms of one of the organizational elements that the general bias is we need more content. And what came through loud and clear in the Seismic show this week was that there's really a lot more rigor, both in terms of really understanding users and segments, as well as understanding the analytics to get deeply into thinking strategically about where do you invest scarce resources to build content that moves the needle. How do you make sure that you're developing a sustainable strategy? Because what came through loud and clear from presentations is more is not more, number one. And number two is the insights about what content is being used by who and when, and particularly at what stage of the sales cycle, is a critical component as organizations think about how are they going to scale their revenue generation machine. There were many presentations and many observations about people being overrun by content and by saying yes to a lot of demands, that when you step back and do the analytics, the type of information that you can find in the Seismic solution or in Compost and in other related solutions in the category broadly around sales engagement and sales enablement, is there's got to be a lot deeper diagnostic about who's using what and when are they using it. And I think part of the aha there when listening to some of the case studies about people who are really using content for strategic advantage is that content is quickly moving around the corner from just being thought about in isolation to being thought about as core to an integrated sales process and an integrated revenue process. And there's a lot of great examples of this, but I think the trap, and one of the observations I have coming off the back of the show for revenue leaders, is that one of the content traps with more is more is that it's not really mapped back. And when I say it, I mean content. Think white papers, think case studies. Lots of us who come from a sales background are used to the idea of a first call presentation. They're able to kick off or catalyze a conversation when they're able to engage with a prospect on the phone. Then what? And I think the high ground here and the opportunity around changing the game from more is more in content is really having an integrated dialogue between marketing and sales ops, as well as, sales enablement or the sales engagement team, to talk about what content do you use at what part of the sales cycle. And let me break that down for a minute for you. The simple way to think about this, particularly if you put your marketing hat on, is there's top of the funnel content. What is the compelling, unique value proposition that we have, and why do we understand your market? Why can we help you solve a problem that you have? Lots of us spend a lot of time in the top of the funnel content, and sometimes that's ebooks, sometimes that is some version of a white paper, particularly for a more technical sell. There's lots of case studies and lots of information that all of us crank out every single day, and then we put in the hands of salespeople to try to help them really make the case that we know you have a problem and we can help you. What's interesting, though, is that from the experience that I have talking to customers, and I was having this conversation with a customer the other day, and what she said was, we've got a great marketing department. The challenge we have is that a lot of the content that they're producing doesn't look like the sales conversations we're having. And my team can't decode the memo. They can't, it's too hard or too complex. And so we've got a lot of great stuff, but a lot of it's not being used, in part because our sales team and our pre-sales team really doesn't understand where we are in the process, or maybe more specifically, what content is applicable at what part of the sales process. And I think that paints the picture for an opportunity for all of us as we're refining and going into budget season, as we think about Q4 and beyond, is when we start to think about investments for next year, when we think about go-to-market models and how do we optimize resources to drive a more compelling value proposition and to generate value for customers, what we need to step back and think about is how do you bring sales and the sales team together with the marketing team and with anybody who's in a content facilitation or content creation position in the organization, and really take apart the buyer journey in the sales process. What do we need to know as we move from top of the funnel? We have a problem and we believe you have a problem and we can solve it with our solutions, our goods and services, to more of the middle funnel content and the late funnel content. including how do I use case studies, particularly in the middle of the funnel, to help deliver the proof points? How do I put together white papers and how-to guides and best practices that are really going to help me drive and educate the prospect on the art of the possible and start to give them a playbook? How do you go from wherever you are today to going forward? And finally, then, what are some other things for them to start to think about in terms of organizing their assets, their resources, their organization to actually bring this to life? Because there's always a great vision conversation to be had as you get into the middle of a sales cycle, and particularly as you learn more about the customer and their needs. And oftentimes where the content equation falls down is the how. We have the what, we have the why, but what customers more and more need, and we see this all the time in complex B2B sales cycles, is you need to address the different audiences in terms of how are they going to be successful? How am I going to deploy your solution? Who's going to be involved with that? What are the ramifications? What does the project plan look like? What are the costs? Not just the explicit, license and services costs. How do you paint the vision of the customer for them about what they should be thinking about and where this is going to take them? And how do you ground that with customer stories and proof points? I don't know of any marketing or sales leader who thinks they've got the story dialed in terms of the solution dialed in terms of everybody on their team, on the revenue team, understanding the buyer journey, understanding the sales process, and understanding what are the content, assets, and resources very prescriptively that you need to use at every stage of the sales process to guide, enable, to coach the customers and the prospects and help them be successful. So I'll come back here in a second with a couple points of view about where to take the conversation and what to think about as you're architecting both your budget and your content strategy. But let's pause a second here to pay the bills, and we'll be right back talking about content and talking about strategy from the Seismic Shift User Conference.
We live in a subscription economy. You're only as successful as your customers, and that requires a mindset shift from what's our strategy for the customer to what's our customer's strategy and how can we help. Focusing on your customers' needs and providing value in every interaction is critical to building long-term relationships and sustained sales success. The challenge for most sales leaders and their teams is their sales process doesn't match how customers buy in today's digital world. Sustained growth and sales execution are impossible because the revenue team isn't aligned with consistent process and methodology to understand their customers' people and their problems. Altify's customer revenue optimization solutions activates the entire revenue team with a combination of strategy, methodology, and applications to help companies deliver more value to their customers. The result is increased sales velocity, improved win rates, and increased customer satisfaction. With a CRO strategy, now you can effectively collaborate across the entire revenue team to win new business and unlock more cross-sell and upsell opportunities. Built natively on the Salesforce platform, Altify helps revenue leaders and their teams achieve sustained revenue growth and sales success. Visit Altify.com today to see how they help accelerate sales performance for some of the world's best sales teams, including Autodesk, Comcast, GE, Honeywell, Salesforce, Tableau, and United Health Group.
Welcome back, everybody. The topic today is all about, my observations and some of the challenges around architecting a content strategy, having spent a few days down in sunny San Diego with my friends and partners at Seismic at the Seismic Shift User Conference. What I was just talking about, the aspects of how to think about top of the funnel, middle of the funnel, and bottom of the funnel, what it really points to is the opportunity to up-level the engagement game that you have, not just the marketing sales internal engagement game, but facilitating the right kind of conversations with customers. One of the things that comes out of the Seismic Shift conference, and as I mentioned earlier, Toby Murdoch from Kapost was on a couple weeks ago, and I'm going to go to the Kapost conference here in a couple weeks in Boulder, so I'm definitely looking forward to that. The big headline here is there's a lot more intersection and a lot more focus between revenue leaders and particularly sales, marketing ops, and trying to get content harmonized with sales process. And that's really the world we live in here at Altify. is how do we help organizations develop a customer-focused strategy to get inside the heads of customers, to really help them be successful, and to deliver a strategy and a series of solutions that helps them optimize revenue with customers. And what I find when I sit down with sales leaders is they want help in figuring out how do you do account-based sales and marketing strategy. And when you peel the layers back, oftentimes you get to an intersection, as I mentioned a second ago, of how do you map the customer's journey to the sales process, to the content process and the content strategy that you have. And I think there's a couple key pieces as you're thinking about how do I do this more effectively, and how do I make sure I arm my team to be more effective as they think about content and resources and building a plan for next year. There's really, I think, three pieces of the puzzle here. Number one is start with the customer and the buyer journey. Oftentimes, the content discussion goes off the rails pretty quickly because it's focused on who are we and what are we trying to sell and what do our products and services look like. And step number one is start with the customer and start with the buyer journey as you understand it today, to get to what do we need to do to guide them and orchestrate them from early on just investigative conversations, oftentimes not talking to a human. They're going to find you in multiple channels. They're going to find you on the web. They're going to find your customers. They're going to find it from their own networks. Are we arming all the different channels with a compelling value proposition based on what does the customer need? And that's really core to any kind of CRO strategy, but I think that's core to great marketing too, is really deeply understanding who is your ideal customer, what are the pain points, and what problems are we solving, and architecting a content strategy that's aligned to those needs. That's number one. Number two is look to harmonize the sales process with the content delivery and the content strategy that you have. Part of making content and content strategies actionable is mapping very clearly that top of the funnel, middle of the funnel, bottom of the funnel kind of marketing way to think about content and think about the buyer journey back to the sales stages and the specific sales process. It's critically important, and one of the ahas in terms of how do you drive better sales performance and how do you use content to do that is to map and guide the sales and the revenue team what content very specifically should be used and is most likely to be used at every step of the sales process. So whether you have descriptive names for that, or many organizations just have, stage 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, every one of those stages, from the evaluation to really understanding and qualifying, is there a deal, to understanding can we win and how do you drive to the end game to close one business, that process should map one-to-one with content and assets so that you can be very prescriptive with your partners in sales if you're on the marketing side, or vice versa. You can be very specific with your partners in marketing and sales enablement about what are the types of content that are required at this stage, what are your prospects and your customers most often asking for, and what is the highest utility to them. And, pro tip, don't be afraid to reach out to your prospects or to your existing customers and do a diagnostic on your sales cycle and ask them, not just with you, but with the other vendors they work with, hey, what content really resonates and why? When you're making purchasing decisions, what are they looking at? Not just who are they talking to, because we're all trying to figure that out, but what do they look at? What are the trusted resources? What are the form factors, whether it's short videos, it's case studies, it's ebooks, it's white papers, it's detailed technical documentation. Different industries have different subsegments and different needs, but the reality is you've got to map the process of which you're executing and prosecuting your sales cycle to your content strategy and coloring in those boxes, if you will, so that salespeople and revenue teams don't have to figure it out. The playbook's already been written for them. And then finally, the third piece of the puzzle is really taking a hard look at the analytics about what's being used and where it's being used. Because bottom line here is there are lots of needs for content, and it's important to keep content fresh. It's important to be really focused on what's interesting and compelling to your target audience. But unless you have the data to back it up, unless you understand what's being downloaded, what's being opened, what's being used, there is no way to crack the code to really materially scale revenue and to really maximize the scarce resources you have, not just in the marketing team in terms of there's a cost and a production requirement, and there's a time requirement on the marketing side, But arguably, the bigger wasted cost and the bigger opportunity gain is with the sales enablement team and with your revenue team, with the people who are touching customers. Make it easy to be prescriptive with them by playing back to them the metrics about what's being opened, when it's being opened, how it's being used, how it's being shared, and show them what good looks like. And be able to point to the metrics in terms of looking at the top performers on the revenue team and really doing that diagnostic. What content are they using? What channels are they using it in? And do we have a plan to help not just them, but the entirety of the team improve their engagement, improve their ability to tell stories, improve their ability to really put the right kind of assets and information in front of their prospects as and when they need it to advance the revenue cycle and to advance them in the sales process. So I'm going to come back to this topic more because as somebody who spent 25 years in marketing, I've been challenged with content a long time. I had a great time at the Seismic conference, and we're appreciative of Seismic as partners. I would invite anybody, if they're looking to try to crack the content code, to reach out to organizations like Seismic and like Kapost that have really great solutions, not just for managing content and understanding the analytics, but you can map the process and the needs that you have, the customer insight that you have, and do it in a way that, as Toby talked about a few weeks ago, becomes operational, becomes scalable, and becomes core to helping you surprise, delight, and educate your customers, because that's where the high ground is. And if we can help you from a sales process point of view, don't hesitate to reach out to any of us here at Upland Altify or anybody in the organization, or we'll point you to other resources and other organizations who we think are doing a great job with this and can help you be successful. And with that, I'll wrap it up here for another edition of Revenue Optimization Radio. Thanks again. If you like the show, we'd appreciate your feedback and appreciate you giving us thumbs up and 5 stars on Spotify or Apple Music or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you've got suggestions for shows, we'd love to hear from you too. So don't hesitate to reach out. We're looking forward to talking to you soon, and have a great and productive week on the revenue team. Thanks so much.
You've been listening to another episode of Revenue Optimization Radio with your host, Patrick Morrissey from Altify, right here on the Funnel Radio Network for at-work listeners like you.